Good afternoon and welcome to our professional development session. Our session today will focus on inclusive practices in the classroom. My name is Elizabeth Hill and I'll be your presenter for today. A little bit about my background. So I've been a teacher now for 4 years. In that 4 years I've worked in mainstream and I've worked in learning support. Currently I'm working in a special education school in a class of 12 students. So I do have some background in a lot of different areas of education, and I hope today that you'll find our session on inclusive practices informative. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me at the end of the session. So our learning today directly relates to the professional standards for teachers, which are set by AITSL, the Australian Institute for Teaching and Learning. Our professional development today relates to Standard 1, knowing students and how they learn, and Standard 6, engaging in professional learning. The Australian professional standards for teachers are relevant for all teachers, and if you are accumulating your evidence for accreditation, it's good to keep some evidence from this professional development as well. So why are we here talking about inclusive practices today when there are a scope of educational issues we could be having this professional development on? Well, an interesting study was conducted by Mergler, Carrington, Kimber and Bland in 2016 in Queensland University. The study was investigating undergraduate students' views towards inclusion. The methodology the researchers used was they interviewed first year and fourth year education students. The students were interviewed and asked to rank a number of values which are considered important in teaching. Some of the values included being fair, being kind and compassionate, and most importantly for us, being inclusive and accepting. So the findings were first year education students ranked being inclusive and accepting as their 5th most important value. Fourth year education students who undertook units of study focused on inclusive practices ranked being inclusive and accepting as their 2nd most important value. Alternatively, fourth year students who did not undertake any units and inclusive practices ranked being inclusive and accepting as their 5th most important value. So you can see a big difference there between the students who had taken inclusive practices and ranked it as their 2nd most important value, and fourth year students who had not taken any units on inclusive practices as their 5th most important value. So this study sums up why we're here. My aim today is to discuss inclusive practices and give you a range of strategies that you can use to be inclusive in your classroom. I hope that through your participation in the unit, your knowledge on inclusive practices will be increased and you will consider being inclusive and accepting as an important value in teaching. I also hope that you will inspire a change in the current education setting, as Australia is becoming increasingly diverse, and in the future we will need to have a range of inclusive practices to accommodate all our students. So what does it mean to be inclusive? Inclusion means delivering a high quality education to all students. This means regardless of student diversity, which we'll talk more about later. Inclusion also focuses on addressing those issues which can be disinclusive, such as marginalization, segregation, and exclusion in policy and practice. So this means school policies need to ensure that they are inclusive of all students, regardless of their learning abilities, learning styles, physical needs, physical abilities. And this goes for us in our teaching practice as well. We need to accommodate the needs of all students. So 3 terms we'll be hearing a lot today are inclusion, diversity, and differentiation, as they are all linked. So diversity refers to differences in students. So student diversity can be religion, language, culture, intellectual abilities, socioeconomic background, likes and dislikes and interests. We know in a classroom of 25 students, you're not going to have 2 students who are the same. And this goes for their learning as well. You're not going to have 2 students who learn exactly the same. And that's where teachers come in to differentiate the learning to ensure that all students can feel successful in the classroom. So one point I want to make is that it has never been good practice to teach all students as if they were alike. So even though if that is the way that you were taught, that there was one activity and one way of doing that activity, that doesn't mean that that is the way that we need to teach. The first step of being inclusive in your classroom is getting to know your students. This means understanding their interests, their likes, their abilities, their aspirations, and using this in your teaching. So getting to know your students can be beneficial for the teacher, as you can create a safe environment for all learners. You can gauge their readiness for learning, and particularly literacy and numeracy. You can understand where in the syllabus that student is up to. So even though they might be in stage 2, they might be working at stage 1 outcomes, and that's where your differentiation will come in. You can also demonstrate emotional intelligence in the classroom. So if you know a particular task is quite hard for a student, you can have different scaffolds built in to assist that student achieve that task. So there are some strategies you can use to get to know your students at the beginning of the year, which are fun and engaging. So student passports is one, which I have done once before, where I had some information about the student that they had to fill in, and we kept them on the classroom, so it's almost like a learning passport as well. And it had their interests, their likes, something special about them, and that worked really well. Also, you can get to know your students by setting learning and social goals. What I've done before is at the beginning of the year, the students will set a learning goal. So there might be one area of their learning like writing or reading or counting that they want to improve on, and they set the goal at the beginning of the year. This helps me as the teacher get to know what they think the areas they need to improve on is. As well, you can do diagnostic academic assessments. So you might give a simple literacy or numeracy assessment to see where they're up to. Scholastic Australia had a good suggestion on their website of making a little slideshow about yourself as the teacher, and then making a class slideshow about the students, which would be fun as well. And also simple games. So in my class at the moment, we've got 12 students. At the beginning of the year, we sat in a circle. We had a ball, and each time we went around the circle, we said something different about ourselves. So the first time we went around the circle, we spoke about what we like to do. The second time we said our favorite color, and the third time we said our favorite food. So here are 2 examples of ways you can get to know your students. So it's an All About Me template, and it has some of their favorite things, who's in their family, and things that are interesting about them. And another version of this is a little flip book about themselves that you can then keep in your records or in the classroom. And it has their hobbies and who's in their family and a little bit about them as well. So these are more engaging ways to get to know your students. I have a short video to show you now by Larry Falazzo, which details different ways that teachers can differentiate for their students. While the video is playing, I want you to jot down the 3 different ways teachers can differentiate for their students and some strategies that they can use to do this.
Treating everyone equally. It's recognizing that all of our students bring different gifts and challenges, and that as educators, we need to recognize those differences and use our professional judgment to flexibly respond to them in our teaching. Carol Tomlinson talks about the ability to differentiate in 3 areas: content, process, and product. For content, student choice is one way we might differentiate, like allowing students to choose their research topics or essay prompts. As teachers, we need to keep our eyes on the prize. In other words, we have to keep asking ourselves, what are the main learning objectives? differentiate by process, teachers can change up how they group students. Sometimes a mixed ability group might work best, while sometimes it might be appropriate to have same ability groups. We might have an English proficient buddy work with an English language learner to help them out. Teachers can also differentiate by the type of product students create. The major demonstration of learning doesn't always have to be an essay or a multiple choice test.
So I hope you jotted down that the 3 different areas teachers can differentiate in our content, process and product. We're going to go into more depth in each of these areas to really understand what each means and strategies we can use to differentiate the content, product and process. Content refers to what the students will learn. In New South Wales, content is dictated by the New South Wales Australian syllabus. Okay, so each of the key learning areas has their own syllabus with outcomes and indicators which dictates what we need to teach. Also, when differentiating content, high quality curriculum ensures that we're spending time on the content we need to be spending time on, and it's relevant and intellectually challenging for the students in our class. Differentiation ensures that this invitation to access the high quality curriculum is given to all the learners in the class. Station teaching refers to a style of teaching where students are grouped either by ability or mixed ability and rotate around the classroom to complete different activities. So I've done it in literacy numerous times where I might have one group who might be reading with me, another group might be working on comprehension, and then a third group might be working on spelling or writing. And it works really well because you can have the students grouped in mixed ability grouping or in ability groups depending on your students. Another strategy to differentiate the content is a personal agenda where each student has something that they need to accomplish in the lesson, and it might be different from another student who's sitting right next to them. Also, material selection based on students' literacy levels. So this would be choosing books which are within the student's independent range of reading, or choosing writing prompts or scaffolds that are based on the students' literacy levels and what they need. Also, another method which I use when I do whole class shared reading is tiered questioning. So tiered questioning is where you might target specific students with specific questions. So for my students who have low comprehension levels, I will target them with questions focusing on the who, the what, and the where in the picture or the story. Whereas for my higher ability students, I might target them with questions such as why, questions relating to the emotions of the characters and predicting what will happen in the story. And that's tiered questioning, and it's based on the students' abilities. And you can use this tiered questioning not only with shared reading but also in numeracy as well, asking the students what strategies they've used and other strategies they can use. So now we're going to talk about differentiating the learning process. Process refers to the activities the students are going to do in the lesson. So teachers can modify the activities based on the students' interests, learning styles, and use different modes of presentation and demonstration of student learning. So modes of presentation might be using ICT to teach a new topic or content, using books, using paper-based resources, and this is the same for students being able to demonstrate their learning. So use a range of modes. They might give a speech or make a poster or make a PowerPoint. Okay, so differentiating the learning process, some strategies that you can use. Again, station teaching, because you can have different activities at each station and for each group. Allowing students to have more choice in their learning, so for things like writing topics or for projects and presentations. Also collaborative discussion in group with roles is a really good one, because you can actually target specific students for specific roles in that group. So one student might be the group leader, the other student might be the discusser in the group, and so you can really target students in the group. The last strategy you can use to differentiate the process is task complexity. Okay, so you can vary the level of support and independence in a task. So if you have a student who are higher ability, they might be able to complete a task with little prompt from the teacher and little support prompts as well. Or you might have students who have higher needs and will require a prompt from a scaffold or additional resources, and then you might have other students who will require a prompt from a scaffold and resource and teacher prompting. Okay, so this is where it's really important to know your students. So now we're going to talk about differentiating the product. So product refers to what the students create to show their learning. You might also call this an assessment. Student option is integral when differentiating the product. Okay, so giving the students a choice is absolutely integral. So this ensures that the final product is a true representation of what the students have learned throughout the unit. So I recently set a geography task focusing on Australian landmarks, and I allowed the students to choose their medium of presentation, and some students went with a poster, other students went with a speech, and some also went with a PowerPoint. And it made it really interesting when we were reviewing the presentations, because each student who came up the front, each presentation was completely different. So allowing student choice in how to demonstrate their learning is a strategy to differentiate the product, and also making a deal option. So this is where a student may have an idea of how they want to show their learning, and it might not be an idea that you have. So you make a deal with them that it's okay for them to show how they're learning, how they want to show it. So we've spoken about content, process, and product, and how we can differentiate these to create an inclusive classroom. Now we're going to speak about some of the challenges that can come with being inclusive and differentiating learning for your students. So some of the challenges of inclusion are actually teachers' preconceived notions of what schools should be. So if you were educated in a way where one size fits all and all students were taught the same, then in your mind, this is what teaching is. Okay, so teachers' preconceived notions of teaching and what schools should be can actually be a barrier to inclusion, as it is something completely different to what some teachers may have experienced in their education. Also, time can be a barrier to inclusion, as there is only a certain amount of planning time teachers get, and there is only a certain amount of time in a day to teach all the key learning areas which are required. Also, prescribed materials and programs. So you might be given a program by your school or by your local area which must be taught. It can be quite difficult to be inclusive and differentiate when you're given a program to teach. Also, knowledge of how to differentiate. So we've been through how to differentiate content, process, and product. So you should have a fairly good knowledge of the 3 different areas in which you can differentiate for your diverse students' needs. Also, a challenge can be getting to know your students. So finally, just some recommendations to summarize our professional development today. Get to know your students. This is absolutely integral for inclusive practices. Use evidence-based practices to differentiate content, process, and product. So some of the strategies we mentioned today. Talk to your teacher colleagues about inclusion and differentiation, and ask them the strategies that they use. And keep improving and sharing your knowledge of quality inclusive practices. Thank you for joining me for our professional development on inclusive classroom practices. I hope you found it informative, and I hope you can use some of these strategies in your own teaching. I look forward to seeing you in the classroom.